April 25th, 1945. Bavaria. The Third Reich is not just dying, it is rotting from within, leaving a trail of ash and silent screams across the European continent. But here, in the shadow of the Alps near Bad Tolz, the war feels like it has held its breath. The air is thick with the cloying scent of expensive tobacco, damp earth, and gun oil. General George Patton steps out of his olive-drab jeep. His face is a mask carved from granite. He is not here to sign surrender papers or offer polite handshakes to a defeated foe. He is here because his intelligence units reported something that defies the laws of war, something that sickens even a man who has walked through the blood-soaked sands of Tunisia and the mud of Sicily. Behind those massive oak doors of the SS headquarters villa, 3 high-ranking generals are playing cards. They aren't hiding in bunkers. They aren't reaching for cyanide. They are sitting in perfectly pressed uniforms, sipping Napoleon brandy from crystal snifters. But the stakes on that table are not marks or gold. They are playing for lives. Specifically, the lives of 10 American tankers from the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, men who fought through hell just to become poker chips in the final, twisted amusement of the Nazi elite. Every hand lost meant a muffled gunshot in the courtyard. Within 10 minutes, no one in that room will be alive except Patton and his shadow. Official history spent 80 years trying to burn the reports of the next hour. Because what Patton did was not justice in the eyes of a courtroom. It was something far more primal, something far more terrifying. Did Patton go too far, or was this the only language the enemy understood? That is for you to decide. Tell me in the comments right now. What is more important in the heat of war? The letter of the law or the weight of a soul? To understand the sheer gravity of this moment, we have to look at the men across the table. These were not conscripted boys. These were architects of the final solution. Men who viewed the Geneva Convention as a suggestion for the weak. Their defiance was absolute. Even as the Soviet boots drummed toward Berlin and the American 7th Army closed the noose, these SS generals maintained a staggering level of scorn. They chose the 761st because they knew Patton valued them. The Black Panthers had proven themselves in the mud of the Saar Basin and the freezing fog of the Ardennes. To the Nazis, these men were not soldiers. They were a subhuman challenge to their twisted ideology. By turning their execution into a game of chance, the SS generals weren't just committing a war crime. They were committing a violation of the warrior's code. Imagine the scene. A room paneled in dark, ancient wood. Stag horns on the walls. A portrait of the Führer staring down with vacant eyes. On the table sits a deck of cards, a silver ashtray with a smoldering cigar, and a handwritten list of names. 7 names have already been crossed out in red pencil. 7 young men from Alabama, Ohio, and New York. Men who survived the carnage of the beachheads, only to die because a Standartenführer didn't pull a spade. The arrogance was suffocating. When Patton kicked the doors open, one of the Germans didn't even stand up. He simply tossed a queen of hearts onto the pile and smiled. In that smile was the total defiance of a monster who believed his rank and his race made him untouchable. They expected Patton to play the role of the civilized victor. They expected a formal arrest, a warm cell, and a trial that would drag on for years. They thought Patton was one of them, an elite officer who would respect the stripes on their shoulders. They were about to realize that George Patton didn't see generals. He saw rabid dogs. The silence that followed was heavy, like the air in a room before a lightning strike. Witnesses would later say the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. This was the cold fury. Patton didn't scream. He didn't unleash a barrage of his famous profanity. He stood perfectly still, the only sound in the room being the slow, rhythmic creak of his leather gloves as he tightened his grip on his riding crop. He walked toward the table. Every step of his polished, three-buckle boots sounded like a hammer hitting a coffin lid. He didn't look at the generals. He looked through them. He approached the window and looked down into the courtyard. There, kneeling in the Bavarian mud, were the final 3 tankers. The rest were already slumped against the stone wall, their blood mixing with the cold spring rain. The SS general at the head of the table began to speak in clipped, arrogant English. He talked about the rights of officers. He talked about international law and the protocols of surrender. He even had the audacity to suggest that Patton should join them for a drink to discuss the Bolshevik threat in the East. Patton reached out and picked up the last card on the table, the ace of spades. He looked at it for a long time, his eyes as hard and transparent as Arctic ice. The smell of ozone from the approaching storm outside began to fill the room, mixing with the scent of his own cologne and the bitter smoke of the Nazi cigars. This was the atmosphere before the explosion. I want you to pause and put yourself in that room. You are standing behind the most feared general in the Western world. You see the blood on the list of your men. You see the smirks on the faces of the murderers. Would you have the restraint to wait for a judge in a powdered wig thousands of miles away? Or would you feel the steel in your hand demanding a different kind of answer? Tell me, how would you have reacted in that heartbeat? The breaking point didn't come with a shout, but with a movement so fast the guards almost missed it. Patton flipped the heavy oak table with a strength fueled by pure, righteous adrenaline. Crystals shattered. The Napoleon brandy spilled across the floor, soaking the red-penciled list of names and the pristine trousers of the SS officers. He didn't call for the military police. He didn't wait for an adjutant to bring him a pen. Patton drew his ivory-gripped Colt .45 and leveled it at the senior general's forehead. The German's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by the gray, hollow mask of a man who realized he was no longer talking to a diplomat, but to an executioner. But Patton didn't pull the trigger. That would have been too clean, too merciful. He ordered his guards to drag the 3 Nazis into the courtyard. He led them down the stone stairs, his boots clicking a steady, lethal rhythm. When they reached the mud, Patton personally cut the ropes binding the hands of the 3 surviving Black Panthers. He handed his own sidearm to the sergeant, a man who had just watched his best friend die for the sake of a card game. Patton looked the sergeant in the eye and said a single sentence that would never appear in the official archives of the United States Army. The game is over. It is your turn to deal. This wasn't just an execution. It was an act of cosmic justice. Hard, concise, and absolute. 3 volleys of fire tore through the silence of bad tolls. Patton didn't flinch. He didn't turn his head. He simply took out a cigar, lit it with his gold lighter, and looked at his watch. He turned to his aide and said, "Record this. The prisoners attempted to escape during transport. Bury them in an unmarked pit, and don't you dare waste a single wooden cross on them. Why was this story buried for 80 years? Why is it that in the history books, we only see Patton the strategist, the master of the Third Army's dash across France, and never Patton the judge of the Bavarian courtyard? Because the world being built after 1945 didn't have room for this kind of truth. The politicians in Washington needed a clean narrative. They needed a world where the law was supreme, even if the law was too slow to catch the devil. They were terrified of Patton's unpredictability. They feared that if a general was allowed to execute the enemy without a trial, the entire structure of military command would crumble. But for the men of the 761st, it wasn't about command. It was about the only thing that matters when the world is on fire: loyalty. Patton's actions that day were the beginning of his end. Eisenhower and Bradley began to see him as a liability, a man who would just as easily march on Moscow with the same icy resolve. They saw a man who put the honor of a soldier above the convenience of a treaty. This story changed the course of history because it marked the moment the old blood and gut style of war died, replaced by the gray, bureaucratic warfare of the Cold War. It showed that on every battlefield, there comes a moment where the law stops, and all that remains is a man and his conscience. Patton chose his conscience. He chose his soldiers. Today, this event remains one of the most polarizing moments in military history. One side argues that Patton became the very thing he fought against: a lawless executioner. The other side insists that this was the only way to truly cauterize the wound of Nazism. So, I ask you for the final time, was Patton's justice a war crime that stained the American flag, or was it the only honorable act left in a dishonorable war? Does the world need uncomfortable heroes like Patton today, or should we leave this kind of justice in the past? I am waiting for your thoughts in the comments. This is a debate that strikes at the very heart of what it means to be a soldier and a human being. Subscribe to the channel to uncover more chapters of history that they tried to hide.
Thanks for watching until the end. I'll see you in the next story.